Hello, welcome to the episode of the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Bahnsen. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today we have someone who knows a lot about the markets, a lot about the economy, talks a lot about inflation, housing market, just anything to do with the economy and what's going on. This is the person you want to talk to, and it's none other than David Bahnsen. David, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's really a pleasure to have you on. After we've chatted a couple times here and there over the years, I've had some good discussions about inflation and things of that nature that's been going on here recently. So I really wanted to have you on to have this conversation. I also know that, look, you've been well connected with the folks who have been living and breathing the pro-growth policies of, Art Laffer and Larry Kudlow and others. And so it's really good to have your insights here today. Let me go ahead and give the audience your bio here first, and then we can just jump right in. So David oversees the management of over $3.9 billion in client assets. Prior to launching the Bahnsen Group, he spent 8 years as the managing director at Morgan Stanley and 6 years as vice president at UBS. He is consistently named as one of the top financial advisors in America by Barron's, Forbes, and the Financial Times. He is a frequent guest on CNBC, Bloomberg, Fox News, and Fox Business, and is a regular contributor to National Review. He hosts the popular weekly podcast Capital Record, which you should all check out, dedicated to defense of free enterprise and capital markets. He writes daily investment commentary at the DCToday.com and weekly macro commentary at dividendcafe.com. David is a founding trustee for Pacifica Christian High School of Orange County and serves on the board of directors for the National Review Institute in New York City. He is the author of several best-selling books, including his newest book, There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths, which was released in November of 2021. David's true passions include anything related to USC football, the financial markets, politics, and Chinese food. His ultimate passions are his wife of 20 plus years, their children, and the life they've created together on both coasts. It's a fantastic background. David, I'm really looking forward to talking to you today. So to get things started, what motivates you to do what you do each and every day?
Well, I really do believe that my economic foundation is rooted in an understanding of the human person that should motivate everybody. When we talk about supply side economics, for example, I think we're talking about things in the policy realm that have to do with removing impediments, creating the right incentives for growth and productivity. And yet even that is really just a sort of extension of what we believe about human anthropology, what the nature of the human person truly is. And I believe that in economics that focuses on growth, economics that focus on work, on creating solutions, these are all things that get beyond academic economics and where people might find some of the models or math or science boring. I don't find it boring to study those things that can create higher quality of life for humanity. And that's how I've always viewed economics. I believe that the production of goods and services that meet the needs of humanity is a vitally important thing. And I become extremely distraught over how convoluted the conversation gets when we abandon that basic truth about what we're trying to do in economics. So that drives me every day. And I happen to have a day job that allows me to connect all these dots. I can work on the cause of human flourishing, both by creating better results for clients we work with, but by doing so using the very financial markets that I love, by investing in human ingenuity as expressed in various aspects of capital markets.
Well, that's fantastic. And it's a great way to think about it. Whenever I think about economics, you're right. We put all this math out there and think about the theories, and those are all important, but ultimately it comes down to the human person. I mean, economics is really a study of humans, human action and interaction, and how they live together within institutions to satisfy our desires, given scarce resources. And so within this institutional framework, it's so important to think about, ultimately, we're talking about people. We're not talking about cats or widgets or something else. It really is about people, and human flourishing is, I love the way you put that, because ultimately that's what we're trying to solve. I mean, that's what I'm working on a lot here in the Let People Prosper show, and in my work, working in a lot of different areas on public policy, is really to get government out of the way. And one thing great about you, David, is it's not that you're just talking the talk, but you're walking the walk. Your theories and your ideas are being put to a test of your in the markets. And so you're walking that as well. And so I wonder, going back from your theory, your lessons that you've learned over time in economics, how has that helped you within the financial markets, and therefore also the financial markets helping you with your economics?
Well, I love the way you've asked the question, because I think you're pointing to a sort of virtuous cycle. There's a positive feedback loop that gets created. I believe that my fundamental philosophical beliefs about economics help a great deal in practical application of finance and investment, because I have very little temptation to get distracted by things that pull me away from human activity. Human action carried out in the marketplace is what I believe in, and most bad investments over the years have been some distortion or distraction from human activity. Getting carried away with a shiny object, looks like free money, but is not connected to that human spirit and fundamentally the profitable production of goods and services. So I'm a real fundamentalist about this stuff. And a lot of that is because of my philosophical training, but I really do my best not to abandon it when it comes to what we do day to day. And so that virtuous cycle plays out where I hope it's constantly refining my ability as a thinker, and yet also my thinking is constantly refining our ability to execute.
Well, that's fantastic. Were you a part of were you in the financial sector, I guess, in 08, 09 during the Great Recession?
Oh, I sure was. I was a managing director, as a matter of fact, at Morgan Stanley, which was knee deep in the financial crisis. And, my career in money management began back in the 90s. And so I went through the dot-com implosion as well, and started at a Wall Street firm called Payne Webber that was bought by UBS. And I had moved to Morgan Stanley a few years before the financial crisis. And that was my PhD. I definitely learned through that period an extraordinary amount, and ended up writing a book about it. It was my first book. It was called Crisis of Responsibility. And I became obsessed. I think that there were 75 books written about the financial crisis. It's very possible there's a few outliers that I'm missing, but I did my best to find every book that came out related to the subject of the causes of financial crisis, and I read every one of them, and I reviewed over 50 of them, but ultimately became convinced, Vance, that there wasn't a book out there that was telling the complete story that I wanted told. I thought there were plenty that were highlighting really bad activities from government, from Fannie and Freddie, from the Fed, all of which was accurate. And there were obviously plenty that were highlighting problems at Wall Street, or problems, the left's view that there wasn't enough regulation, or different things like that. But I didn't think there was anyone writing the book of where Main Street broke down morally and culturally. And that was the story I thought needed to be told. And so that became the subject of my first book, Crisis of Responsibility, which really came about as a result of me studying the financial crisis when I was at Morgan Stanley.
Wow. You made me think about that for a second. So given some of the actions that took place, the good faith, the underlying sort of rules of the game, and the credibility that was put to huge shock during that period of time, do you believe that those are things that can be solved through public policy? Or is that something else that we need to be looking at within the financial community?
Well, first, I think that they can be made worse through public policy. And I think Dodd-Frank made a lot of things worse. I do think on the margin, there's certain things that I believe could be improved through public policy. I wouldn't have a huge problem, for example, if credit default swaps had to trade on an exchange or something like that. But, the Basel III and some of the systemic risk issues in the banking system, they're not things that bother me a whole lot, but the fundamental core of a sort of keeping up with the Joneses culture, whether it's institutionally embodied at Lehman Brothers or individually embodied the way Bill and Janet buy their homes on Main Street, either way, I don't think government can regulate covetousness. And I think that was at the heart of the financial crisis. Some of it was more systemic than others, but there are elements of public policy I think can be useful. But no, you go back to tulip mania, and you and I have both studied financial speculative frenzies plenty over the years. There's always plenty of regulation before and plenty of regulation after and human nature still finds a way to capitulate to excess.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. One of the things that we see a lot today, whether it be Tomas Piketty or others who look at this inequality that happens, I think a lot of it also has to do with envy. We have this envy that goes on that ultimately I don't think can be solved by public policy. I like the way you put it. It could actually make things worse, whether it be Dodd-Frank or taxation to try to redistribute income in that sort of sense. But there are opportunity costs, and the seen versus the unseen, Bastiat, the great work there, which comes into play when you think about the overall economy and taxes. Art Laffer, who's a friend to both of us, has a great book, Taxes Have Consequences. I hope to have him on the show soon to talk about that. I know you have here recently on Capitol Record on your podcast, which is a great episode. I hope that everyone goes and checks that out. But I wonder, from your work and what you've done, what do you think about tax policy today, where we're at, given the situation? If there's been a few increases here recently, but what should we be looking at to make sure that we're not, overly distorting labor markets, capital markets, and things of that nature?
So first, the high level takeaway is an expression of gratitude that I think Larry Kudlow is one of my closest friends, hero, mentor, but a very dear friend in my personal life. Art Laffer is an absolute legend. And I think that we owe a debt of gratitude to the fact that it is very hard to raise taxes in our country. It can be done. It has been done. They're usually not very large. And there's a lot of political horse trading that's required to even get tiny marginal tax increases accomplished these days because of the success of the Reagan Revolution and the economic prosperity, the downward pressure on marginal tax rates created, that now you actually hear the President of the United States, a very liberal Democrat, a lifetime U.S. lefty senator, saying, I will not raise taxes no matter what on anyone under $400,000 of income. Now, I don't want to raise taxes on people making $500,000 of income, but the idea that the left has to say, I won't raise taxes even on people at $399,000 of income is hilarious to me, because their own class warfare field goal has had to get moved so much. The goalposts continue to move. And I think that's something that we owe a debt of gratitude to those supply siders who came before us. I do believe, though, that long term, I would prefer that our tax policy follow a better conversation and process on what we want the size of government to be in our society. I think most of our attempts to pick away at taxes. I was a big believer in the President Trump corporate tax cut, but that was a policy we were able to get done, but had to horse trade away some of there was very little individual tax reform there. We left the investment tax code in place. We weren't able to get all of it permanent because of the complicated budget reconciliation rules. So again, some of the things that the Bush administration did, the Trump administration did, I'm all for, on the margin, getting a lower impediment to growth and productivity by taxing less of capital and less of labor. However, I would prefer we could do it holistically by having a government that lives within its means, by having a balanced budget amendment, by having a government that spending is within the confines of the Constitution. And I think we're a ways away from doing that. And once we can define the proper role of government in society, and then fund it appropriately with a tax code that does not hurt incentives, I think that would maximize growth and productivity. And that's always the way I'm going to feel about taxes, is that if we get improvements in taxes but not spending, we've only helped half of the equation, that we truly do need to right-size government. Otherwise, we're continuing to grow deficits and national debt, and of course, we're extracting that money from the private sector.
Amen. I agree. We're recording this on January 23rd, 2023. There's a discussion right now about the debt ceiling and raising it. I mean, ultimately, they're going to raise it. But I think it's important for House Republicans in particular to get something out of it. I mean, you had the Budget Control Act of 2011, which allowed for any sort of increases had to be with budget cuts. And you saw some restraint, even with a Democrat president, Barack Obama. There was restraint that happened during that time, or the latter years of the Clinton administration, where the Republicans, in charge there was some good restraint. Because I agree with you, David. I think that taxes matter at the margin, but ultimately, and just to lay my, cards out on the table, I really think that there ultimately should be more of I'm in favor of a final sales tax, a national consumption tax. I know there's a lot of discussion right now on Twitter about that. But at the end of the day, to me, that's kind of smoke and mirrors, because what we need to be focused on is government spending. Spending is always the problem. We never have a revenue problem. We've really got to focus in on that spending side. It's one of the reasons why I've been so passionate about putting in place spending limits. Having something in there that allows for a spending limit, maybe something like population growth and inflation, but something that can restrain the growth of government. And so I wonder, with the discussion that's been going on right now about the debt ceiling and other things that are happening with the markets, what are kind of your perspective of what's going on there?
Yeah, I think that I feel a little bit isolated in the conversation, because I do believe that a lot of people who share my commitment to being budget hawks and fiscal conservatives are not on board with my tactical concerns, which is that I want that conversation first. Let's have spending limits. Let's legislate. Let's pass a budget. Let's do our job as Congress. But to have funding that has been approved by Congress and then hold the debt hostage has not proven to be a very effective way to ultimately limit the size of government. But one of the big differences in 2023 versus 2011, where there's no question we got some minor benefits out of the sequester and the ultimate limitations on spending that did bring down the deficit by the latter years of the Obama administration. But I don't think that the right has the political or moral credibility now. We fought against Obama era spending. He added about $8 trillion to the national debt in his 8 years. And then we went and added $7.7 trillion to the national debt in 4 years. And now all of a sudden a Democrat's back in office and we're budget hawks again. I don't think the country buys it, and I don't think I buy it. I think we have got to be consistently on board with everything you're talking about, no matter who's president, and not only become fiscal conservatives when there's a Democrat in the White House. So we have a big problem there in terms of moral credibility. And it's going to hurt us with this debt ceiling debate. I would prefer that we pass a balanced budget amendment. I would prefer that we have statutory spending limitations that are indexed to something credible, as you described, GDP growth or what have you. I do think politically there's probably no way to cut spending other than across the board, pro rata, where I would prefer that we cut more of some things and less of others, but I just don't think that's politically doable anytime soon. So there's a lot of things that have to be done, but it's going to take leadership, and we're certainly going to need over time to get all branches of government on board.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, there was a good chart, Cato Institute, David Bose had put it up here recently that showed basically you had the national debt increasing, and then who was president, right, red or blue, and then who was in Congress, the House and the Senate, red or blue. And ultimately, it's a Democrat and Republican problem of overspending. And so there needs to be some more of these restraints in place. In the president's last budget, President Trump's last budget of fiscal year 21, when I was the Associate Director for Economic Policy, Chief Economist there at OMB, we actually put in there a mention of a spending limit, a fiscal rule, which is one of the first times in a long time, especially it wasn't until the Reagan administration that you had talk about that. And it would be great. But at the same time, look, the Trump administration spent too much. Now, of course, Congress has the power of the purse, but the president has a lot of say in what goes on during those conversations, could also veto bills, which is also politically difficult to do as well. But it wasn't a priority of spending restraint in the process that I think that the country really needs to have in order for us to be fiscally solvent. Because soon, David, I know you know all this stuff, but we're going to be spending over $1 trillion just on interest on the debt, over $1 trillion. And so I don't care if somebody's a progressive or a conservative or a libertarian or whoever, we can all think about better ways to use that money. I would rather it be in people's pockets in the private sector compared to government. There's a lot better ways to use that money. And I think this gets us into another point, which I'd love to get your thoughts on is the effect that this is having on inflation. You and I've kind of went back and forth a little bit on this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about inflation and kind of the connection with kind of fiscal policy, monetary policy, and that sort of thing.
Well, I'm vehemently against, well, by the way, just anecdotally to your last point, one thing I don't think either of us mentioned that we should throw out there is not just the president's responsibility and Congress's responsibility, but the people. And that is another element that it has to be fairly mentioned. I don't think the people want spending cuts. I think that most people want the government to spend less, but that's different because they can say the government spends too much, they should spend less than they do. And then when you give specifics as to what needs to be cut, it's cricket. And most spending cuts individually and specifically are very unpopular. And so we have a really big cultural problem to overcome, that the self-government has deteriorated to a point that people embrace big government, and saying we want a big government and we don't want to pay for it is not a solution either. And so we have a lot of work to do to get these things right.
Excellent point. Yep.
Your point on the Fed, I would say this, and I don't think a lot of people understand it, but I know you do very well. And this topic needs to become a bigger source of conversation. And I'm quite convinced that coming out of this inflation hiatus, this period we were in 2021, 2022, I think it creates a great opportunity for a point that is very important to me to be reintroduced, which is essentially treating our central bank as an accomplice to fiscal policy. That something Japan has now had to do for over 30 years, which is ask the Fed to aid and abet excessive government spending. And that's really ultimately what we're dealing with, is a monetary policy that is enabling a government to live outside of its means. And so that during the point of the financial crisis, Paulson and Bernanke on speed dial with each other, there's institutions failing, there's systemic risk. There's obviously a need at that point for a lot of coordination, but it should have been emergency. And a lot of those emergencies never should have happened to begin with. But I'll put that aside and just say, in that moment, emergency things get done, and then you need to go back to normal. And what we have done is embody a permanent relationship between the central bank, Congress, Treasury, that is totally unhealthy for our democracy. And now you saw it during the COVID moment. It was now this time Mnuchin and Powell who were on speed dial with each other. And the Fed literally creating an alphabet soup of special purpose vehicles to facilitate certain governmental programs. All of it at the end of the day basically results in the Fed needing to ease monetary policy to make possible government spending. So the issue of the cost of debt, I think you know my view here. I don't think they will see the cost of debt go up that much, because I think they will be forced to stay near the zero bound for the decade ahead because of that very reason. And that invites all kinds of further distortion and manipulation and intervention that is totally unhelpful in a market economy. And yet that's what you get when you're asking the Fed and Treasury to be far more married than they ought to be. These ought to be very independent institutions.
No, it's a great point, David. And it is one that needs to be talked about more between those connections that happen there. I think, there's a good, almost debate conversation that's going on in the economic sphere. I know you're part of this as well. Is what are the driving factors of inflation, right? And kind of my thinking is I don't choose just one school of economic thought. I mean, I've really come from kind of a combination of things. I probably started off more Chicago school, Milton Friedman, then learned more about the Austrian school with Levin von Mises and Hayek. Talked a lot about the institutional form of economics with Douglas North, but also the supply side economics and how all that stuff fits together. And there's a lot of overlap between them. Also, public choice economics, James Buchanan is another big one that I like. But if you start piecing these things together, in my view, David, fiscal policy isn't really that active in the sense of changing the economic factors in the economy from the spending side. To me, the spending side is just a redistribution. It's just dollars flowing from one part of the economy to another part determined by politicians. And then once you get that limited spending, which goes back to the great point you made earlier, once we have limited spending, how do we efficiently, with the least burdensome way, tax an economy to fund that limited spending? Not to use the tax code as changing people's incentives, because I don't really think that's what the tax code was formed to do. It was to fund limited government spending. And now today, it seems like people want to change people's behavior all the time, whether it be carbon taxes or something else with the tax code. And then whenever you have run a government deficit, then the Fed, as you were talking about earlier, may finance some of that by buying treasuries. We saw a lot of this during COVID. I mean, over the last 3 years, we've seen about $7 trillion in new debt. The Fed's balance sheet increased from $4 trillion to $9 trillion. Not all of that was treasuries, but there was a massive increase in the balance sheet. And to me, it wasn't like the helicopter drop of dollars that went out to people with checks. It was really the Fed printing so much money and chasing too few goods. Now, that's a simplistic form of thinking about it, just from that sort of comment of the too few goods. And one of the things I would hope to happen is that we would have pro-growth fiscal policy to stop the limitation of the supply of labor and goods, right? And so that sort of restraint from regulation, too much regulation by the Biden administration, higher spending and higher taxes are holding that part down at the same time we have demand coming in, leading to the inflationary pressures that we have today. But I think that you have a little bit different view. Maybe it's the same, but I wanted to get your views on how those pieces work together.
Well, my view would be the same, up to the point of marginal utility. In other words,
Yeah.
The law of diminishing return has now said that just like on the fiscal side, that money multiplier that Keynes believed in so much gets highly diluted. And the great economist, Dr. Lacey Hunt, has referred to this as the marginal revenue product. The marginal revenue product of debt has collapsed. And so it used to be, if you assume a certain equilibrium, and then you come into a contraction or recession in the economy, and government spends a lot in sort of classic Keynesian thinking, that fiscal counterpunch, which I'm vehemently against. But in Keynes's model, it assumed equilibrium and it was a one-time type punch. And the multiplier was a lot higher. Now, the multiplier is practically nothing. There's nothing productive left for them to spend money on. There's so much waste and misallocation, and it's already being done on top of such a massive pile of debt that you're getting no productive spending out of it. So the whole fiscal experiment has totally been disproven. And this is what Japan has been running into for decades. Now, the point you're bringing up is where the monetary side comes in. And my view is that they have now run into the law of diminishing return, that there is a marginal utility problem on quantitative easing and certainly on the zero bound of interest rates. You can make the cost of capital cheaper, but if the cost of capital being cheap is not accompanied by more opportunity to invest that capital in productive activity, particularly the production of new goods and services that we all know drives wealth creation, then all you're going to get is leveraging up of incumbent legacy assets. So you get financial engineering, but not productive wealth creation. And this is what I think we've been running into for years. And that's sort of my counterfactual on the quantitative easing, is the government doing a computer entry of more bonds on the balance sheet, and there's an asset and a liability, right? And that money actually does have to be paid back by the government. So they are ultimately not adding to money supply. It doesn't get into the economy. It sits on excess reserves of banks. They did 4 trillion-ish post-financial crisis and got no inflation. They did 4 trillion-ish with COVID and did get inflation. So one school of thought has been that the difference is that the way that money was distributed the second time was different than the first time, that instead of just buying bonds from bank balance sheets, this time they were actually monetizing federal debt. But I don't agree with that. I think they were monetizing federal debt the first time too. The government was running massive deficits then as well. We just didn't have a fiscal package that was so clearly helicopter-ish with the $2,000 payments to people and the PPP and other things that were really directly distributing money in the economy. that certainly, at least for 2020, 2021, did artificially stimulate demand. But velocity has already collapsed on that, and loan demand can't go higher because there's no good borrowers. The good borrowers are already leveraged. And that's where I think the economic lesson I've learned from Japan kicks in, is that fiscal and monetary insanity gets left with nowhere to go, and what we call pushing on a string in Japan. Your rate cut from 5 to 2% is pretty darn stimulative. Your rate cut from 0 to 0 is not. And you're just stuck down at the zero bound and getting a cost of capital lower than the return on invested capital. Incentivizing people to not produce new goods is not useful. So ultimately, I prefer that we, just much like you said about Congress, having certain rules of spending that are tied to GDP growth and other formulas we could create. I think the Fed needs to be rules bound as well. And I'm all for a number of different conversations on how we do that. Nominal GDP targeting, the Taylor rule. There's any number of ways we can do it. But right now, I don't think anyone can doubt that the real rule the Fed has is basically some form of accord with the Treasury Department. And I don't think it's right.
Yep. No, that's a great point. I've had Dr. John Taylor on the show, and we had a great conversation about the Taylor rule, and Alex Salter, who I know you had recently on as well, who's a good friend. And those are great conversations that I think we need to keep having. You know, I think the last thing that I'd like to talk to you about is you wrote a really good piece recently on the housing market. And, you know, you have this money that's flowing in the economy. It's got to go somewhere. And one of those has been the housing market. And I wonder what your thoughts are on the housing market. I've get a lot of friends and just family members and everyone else who's kind of been concerned about the housing market. And I would love to get your thoughts.
Well, this is definitely another area where I make Republicans mad at me sometimes because I don't care at all about housing prices falling a bit, in the sense that housing prices are supposed to reflect a certain equilibrium of supply and demand. And if someone believes prices were supposed to go up 40% in 2020 and 2021, when wages didn't go up anywhere near that, and when there was no and we were already coming off of, I believe, 7 consecutive years of home price appreciation, there's a trend line to the way prices have moved up. And what changed was not wages or economic growth or supply-demand imbalance. What changed was the cost of capital. And by manipulating a home payment lower via a lower interest rate that results in a higher sticker price at purchase, you create a bubble in housing. And so I do believe that it is healthy to have house prices correct, but I frankly have never understood why people care so much. Now, obviously, I understand if someone is selling their house next month, they want to sell it at a higher price than a lower price. But what I've found is that people seem to really hate high house prices when they're trying to help their kid buy a starter home, or when they're getting ready to buy a starter home. Like anything, we like high prices when we're selling, and we don't like them when we're buying. And that tension between buyer and seller is called a market. The question is, do we want the market to be filled with social policy, with governmental regulatory policy, with interventions from Fannie and Freddie, and with cost of capital manipulation from the Fed? All of those things are unhelpful. Do we want supply held artificially low by zoning and environmental and other regulations that keep new home product from being built? Do we want an excess of home supply being built that is financially absurd because of distortions and malinvestment caused by low cost of capital? So whether you're talking about stuff that makes housing go low or high, all I want is interventions out. And I suspect that we need to have a 10 to 20% correction to just get us back to the trend line that we were already on pre-COVID. That's where not only I think things ought to go. It's quite frankly where I think things are going.
Yep. No, I agree with you. I think those are great points that you made on the supply and demand side of too much government intervention, which is a big part of the story that we talked about today, where government needs to get out of the way so that people, free markets, which are just free people, can satisfy their desires and prosper more overall. As we close here today, David, are there any parting words that you'd like to say to the audience?
Well, I really appreciate the conversation and the very thoughtful questions. And I hope that those who are interested in the subject of economics that are wanting to approach fiscal policy, monetary policy, that they'll remember most of what we get, that guys like you and me have found in the policy front. I did not form my opinions on some of the policy or political element based on the politics first and economics second. There's certain economic truths and beliefs that we formulate, and those foundations then become formative into the policy arena. And I think too many times we get it the opposite. If we can be consistently applying first principles to the way we view minimum wage laws, the way we view tax policy, Fed policy, thoughts about housing, regulation, size of government, all those things come after we're dealing with our kind of core philosophical commitments. And that to me is going to make for much better economic policy in the years to come.
Good points, David. It's a pleasure to have you on. I look forward to keeping in touch, and God bless you and your family. And for the audience, thank you for listening. Please rate us a 5-star if you would. That'd be great. And I look forward to our next episode. Until then, let people prosper.